Pico Truncado is a place where the wind never stops screaming. It is a town of oil, dust, and secrets buried deep beneath the cracked earth of Patagonia. In the early morning light of a frozen July, the dawn revealed a sight that would haunt this land forever. A beauty pageant crown, once a symbol of dreams and light, lay discarded in the dirt, its gold stained by a dark, drying blood. In the distance, the blue and red strobe of police sirens cut through the gray fog, marking the spot where a young life was extinguished. This was the end for Johanna Casus, but for her twin sister Edith, it was only the beginning of a descent into a psychological abyss. One sister was murdered. The other would eventually marry the man accused of pulling the trigger. To understand the tragedy, you have to look back at the bond between the twins. Johanna and Edith were identical in every way, two sides of the same coin. As children, they sat on the floor of their bedroom in matching white dresses, holding hands as if they shared a single pulse. But as they grew, the world chose a favorite. Johanna became the Reina, the beauty queen who walked the runways under aggressive camera flashes that popped like small explosions. While Johanna basked in the spotlight, Edith slowly retreated into the shadows, a witness to her sister's fame and the men who circled her like sharks in the dark. One of those men was Victor Cingolani. He was charming, but his eyes were as cold as the southern ice. He watched Johanna dance in the local bars, his cigarette smoke curling around his face like a snake in the grass. Their relationship was a storm of passion and terror. Victor gripped her arm too tightly. His whispers were often threats disguised as love. When Johanna finally tried to pull away, Victor did the unthinkable. He turned his gaze toward Edith. He began to walk with her, to hold her, and to manipulate the twin connection to stay close to his obsession. The air in the Casus home became thick with a low, vibrating dread that no one could escape. The night of July 16th, 2010, was the last time the sun set on Johanna Casus. In a nightclub filled with strobing red and blue lights, she was seen leaving with Marcos Diaz, a man with a possessive temper and tattoos that marked him as trouble. Then came the silence. A single gunshot flash illuminated the desolate Patagonian field for a fraction of a second. The next morning, the forensic teams were combing through the blood-stained wildflowers. They found a spent shell casing and a cigarette, but the investigation didn't look for the truth. It looked for a body to blame. They dragged Victor and Marcos into the interrogation rooms, beginning a legal circus that would defy every law of logic. In 2012, Victor Cingolani was sentenced to 13 years for the murder. The evidence seemed solid. DNA and scent trails pointed to his presence. But as the handcuffs clicked shut, Victor did not look like a defeated man. He looked like a predator who had just finished his first move. From his prison cell, he began to reach out to Edith. He wrote letters that were masterpieces of manipulation. Edith, consumed by a grief that had turned into a dark obsession, began to burn her past. She set fire to the photos of her and Johanna, watching the flames reflect in her eyes as she tried to erase her twin's memory to make room for Victor. The town watched in absolute disgust as Edith Casus arrived at the prison gates on her wedding day. Protesters threw eggs and stones, their shouts of justice for Johanna echoing off the cold stone walls. Inside a clinical, gray prison chapel, Edith stood in a white dress next to a man in an orange jumpsuit. They exchanged rings while a prison guard looked away in shame. The shadow of the bars fell across the couple like a cage, but Edith's face was like stone. She had married her sister's killer, or so the world believed. But the mystery was far from over. As the ink dried on the marriage certificate, a second trial began for Marcos Diaz. New evidence emerged, a CD with his name, a different cigarette, but in a move that shocked the legal world, a second judge sentenced Marcos to 12 years for the same murder. 2 men, 1 bullet, 2 convictions. The justice system had created a paradox where 2 people were paying for a single crime, and the actual truth was buried under layers of corporate greed and local corruption. Marcos screamed at the walls of his cell, while Victor smiled, knowing he had successfully claimed the only thing Johanna had left behind, her sister's soul. While the town whispered about the twins, a young investigative journalist began to notice the gaps in the story. He looked at the old paraffin tests and saw a third shadow in the bushes that the police had ignored. He realized that Johanna wasn't just a victim of a jealous lover. She was a witness who knew too much about the illegal oil leaks in the Pico Truncado fields. The beauty queen had become a threat to a billion-dollar industry. As the journalist dug deeper into the anonymous fan letters and the mysterious black SUVs following him, he realized that Victor and Marcos were nothing more than distractions in a much larger, deadlier game. The marriage of Edith and Victor was not a union of love. It was a fortress of silence. As Victor sat in his cell, enjoying the attention of a national scandal, the real gears of the tragedy began to grind in the background. An investigative journalist, obsessed with the Casus paradox, began to haunt the dusty archives of the Pico Truncado police station. He wasn't looking at the twins anymore. He was looking at the ground. He found a witness statement that had been buried for years. A neighbor who didn't see Victor or Marcos that night, but a third car, a black SUV, speeding away from the ravine with its lights off. The mystery shifted from a crime of passion to a corporate execution. The journalist discovered that Johanna hadn't just been a model. She had been a witness to the illegal dumping of toxic waste in oil fields. In her modeling portfolio, hidden behind the gloss and the glitter, were photos of dead livestock and poison water. The anonymous fan letters weren't from a stalker. They were warnings from a corporate hitman. The journalist realized that Victor and Marcos were chosen because they were the perfect scapegoats. Two jealous men with history, easy to frame in a town that loves a scandal more than the truth. As the journalist pushed further, the shadows pushed back. A black SUV with tinted windows began to follow him through the neon-drenched streets of the city. He was run off the road, his car flipping into a ditch as he desperately tried to upload his findings to a cloud server. He watched from the wreckage as men in polished black shoes burned his laptop, unaware that the data was already screaming across the internet. The Casus case was no longer a local tragedy. It was a national emergency. The names of high-ranking oil executives began to surface, linked to a confidentiality clause in Johanna's final modeling contract that she was about to break. Inside the prison, the atmosphere shifted. Marcos Diaz, once a broken man, found a new reason to live. He began to study the maps of the oil rigs, realizing that the spot where Johanna was found was exactly where a new, illegal pipeline had been laid. He realized he was in a cage not because of a bullet, but because of a billion-dollar secret. Meanwhile, Edith's obsession with Victor began to crack. She found a hidden key in his belongings, a key to a locker containing Johanna's jewelry and a bank statement that Victor could never explain. The devoted wife began to realize she was just another piece on a chessboard she didn't understand. The journalist, now recovered and hiding in a safe house, connected the final dot. The gold ring. In a photograph of Johanna's last pageant, a man in the front row was looking at her with cold, predatory intent. He was the same man who drove the SUV, the same man who visited Marcos in prison to threaten Edith's life. The conspiracy reached the highest levels of the Argentinian government. The simple homicide was actually a high-stakes assassination. The law had been bought, the evidence had been planted, and two sisters had been destroyed to protect a profit margin. The final confrontation began not in a courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. The leaked files ignited a fire that the oil titans couldn't extinguish. Thousands of people took to the streets, holding candles that flickered against the Patagonian wind. They weren't just chanting for Johanna, they were chanting for the end of the oil empire. Federal police, under immense pressure, finally raided the corporate headquarters. They found the Casus stakeout file, a detailed log of Johanna's final days, proving that she was under surveillance long before Victor or Marcos ever entered the field that night. Edith, standing in her kitchen, watched the news as the oil executive was led away in handcuffs. She looked at her wedding ring, a piece of gold that felt like a hot coal against her skin. She realized that by marrying Victor, she hadn't saved him. She had helped the true killers hide behind a curtain of domestic drama. She took the ring off and threw it into the sink, the sound of the metal hitting the porcelain echoing like a gunshot. The mirror was finally starting to clear. The twin connection, once a source of her madness, was now her only source of strength. She knew what she had to do. She had to testify one last time, not for Victor and not against Marcos, but for the girl in the white dress who died alone in the dirt. The final act of the Casus tragedy did not end with a whisper, but with a roar that shook the foundations of Argentina's legal system. As the federal investigation deepened, the Casus paradox began to collapse under the weight of the truth. In 2026, a new trial was convened, the trial of the century. The oil executive, stripped of his gold rings and his power, sat in the same wooden dock where Victor and Marcos had once stood. The air in the courtroom was thick, not with the smell of oil, but with the scent of long-awaited justice. Edith Casus walked to the witness stand, her back straight and her eyes clear. She was no longer the broken twin. She was the voice of a ghost. She spoke of the manipulation, the corporate threats, and the third set of tracks leading toward the oil rig. As she testified, the former model from the modeling agency stood up in the gallery, confirming the secret events Johanna was forced to attend. This simple homicide was officially reclassified as a high-level corporate hit. The judge's gavel fell one last time, echoing like a thunderclap across Pico Truncado. Life imprisonment for the executive. A total exoneration for the men used as pawns. The law had finally admitted its failure, but the scars on the land remained. Marcos Diaz walked out of the prison gates as the sun set over the horizon. He was a man aged by stone and silence, but as he breathed in the cold Patagonian air, he looked truly free. He went straight to Johanna's grave, leaving a single music CD on the headstone, the same evidence that had once stolen his life. In a nearby motel, Victor Cingolani watched the news. He was a free man, but he was a ghost in his own town. The people no longer feared him. They looked through him. He had won his freedom, but he had lost his identity. He was just a hollow warning of what happens when obsession meets a dark opportunity. Edith returned to the abandoned Casus garden. She didn't burn anything this time. Instead, she planted white lilies where she and Johanna used to play as children. The soil, once stained with the tragedy of 2010, was now a place of growth. She had become a leader for the voiceless, using the Johanna's law to protect other women from the same corporate shadows that had swallowed her sister. The town of Pico Truncado began to change. The rusted oil pumps were torn down, replaced by white wind turbines that spun gracefully in the Patagonian wind, cleaning the air that had once been thick with corruption. In the National Gallery, a massive portrait of Johanna was unveiled. She wasn't depicted as a victim, and she wasn't wearing a crown. She was shown with a scale of justice in her hand, her eyes looking forward with a quiet strength. Millions of people stopped to look at her, remembering that the truth has no twin, it stands alone. Edith often visits the gallery, standing before the image of her sister. In the reflection of the glass, their faces still merge, but the fear is gone. There is only peace. The journalist, whose car was once flipped into a ravine, sat at his desk and typed the final words of his book. He pinned a photo of the twins as children to his board. He realized that while the case was closed, the story would live forever as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The darkness that had hidden the crime for 16 years had been pushed back by the light of a single, unwavering truth. As the final sunset dips below the horizon of Pico Truncado, the town's lights come on, one by one, like a sea of stars on Earth. The wind still howls, but it no longer feels like a threat. It feels like a breath of relief. The saga of the beauty queen and the mirror is over. Johanna Casus is no longer a case file. She is a heartbeat. She is the wind. She is finally, eternally at peace. The truth has no twin. It stands alone, in loving memory of Johanna Casus. Justice served. Peace found. The silence in the aftermath of the verdict was not the end. It was a transition into a new kind of haunting. Pico Truncado, a town that had survived on the extraction of oil, was now forced to extract the truth from its own shattered history. For 16 years, the dust of the Patagonian plains had covered the tracks of a third vehicle, a ghost in the machinery of justice that everyone, from the local police to the high-ranking ministers, had chosen to ignore. The investigative journalist didn't just find a story. He found a graveyard of suppressed evidence. He found the missing page 14, a document that contained the frantic scribbles of a first responder who saw the industrial worker's glove near Johanna's body, a detail that was scrubbed from the official record before the ink was even dry. This wasn't just a failure of the law. It was a masterpiece of corporate engineering. The oil industry didn't just own the land, it owned the narrative. They needed a simple story, a jealous boyfriend, a crime of passion, something small enough to fit into a courtroom and large enough to distract from the illegal pipelines running beneath the very field where Johanna took her last breath. Victor and Marcos were never the architects of this tragedy. They were the scaffolding built up to hold the weight of $1 billion secret and then torn down when they were no longer useful. Edith Casus, once trapped in the reflected madness of her twin's murder, became the ultimate whistleblower. Every time she looked in a mirror, she didn't just see her own face. She saw the face of the girl who knew too much. She remembered the whispered conversations Johanna had about the executive parties, the events where beauty was traded for silence. The gold ring on the executive's hand wasn't just jewelry. It was a seal of a hidden empire. When that ring finally hit the table in the evidence room, the sound was the death knell for the old way of life in Patagonia. The Johanna Center that stands today is more than a building. It is a monument to the fact that power has a limit. The wind still howls through the rusted rigs, but now it carries a different message. It tells the story of a sister who refused to forget, a journalist who refused to be silenced, and a beauty queen whose final act was to expose the darkness beneath the earth. The town of Pico Truncado has finally learned that while a lie could be a twin to the truth, it can never replace it. As the final lights flicker on in the valley, we are reminded that justice is not a destination, but a constant vigil. The Casus twins are no longer divided by a bullet or a prison wall. They are united in the light of a truth that cost everything to uncover, but saved a town's soul in return. The truth has no twin. It stands alone. Justice served. Peace found. The aftermath of the wedding of the year left a scar on Pico Truncado that no decree could heal. For years, the town lived in a state of collective cognitive dissonance. They watched Edith walk the streets, a woman who had essentially married a ghost. Every time she visited the prison, she wasn't just visiting a man. She was visiting the crime scene of her own life. The walls of that visiting room saw more than just a husband and wife. They saw the slow, agonizing erosion of a woman's identity. Victor, meanwhile, played his role to perfection. In the prison yard, he was a celebrity, the man who had supposedly conquered the Casus legacy. He didn't realize that his freedom was an illusion maintained by the very corporate powers that had framed him. The investigative journalist spent nights in motels that smelled of stale cigarettes and old paper, tracing the financial breadcrumbs of the oil company. He found that the security budget for the year 2010 had tripled in the months following Johanna's death. This wasn't for fences or alarms. It was for the silence of men who had seen a third shadow near the oil rig. He interviewed a retired foreman who admitted, under the cover of a rainy night, that they were ordered to bulldoze a specific patch of land near the ravine just 48 hours after the body was found. "We weren't leveling the ground," the foreman whispered. "We were burying the evidence of a leak that would have shut the company down forever." As the corporate empire began to bleed, the psychological wall Edith had built around herself started to crumble. She began to have dreams where Johanna wasn't screaming, but pointing at a specific locket hidden in their mother's attic. When Edith finally found it, she discovered a micro SD card tucked behind a childhood photo. On it was a grainy video Johanna had recorded, not of a runway, but of a dark, bubbling pool of oil in a protected reserve. That was the smoking gun. Johanna wasn't killed by a jealous lover. She was killed by a system that couldn't afford a witness with a heart of gold. The release of Marcos Diaz was a quiet affair, but its impact was like an earthquake. When he walked through the prison gates, he didn't look for revenge. He looked for the truth. He met with the journalist in a small, dimly lit cafe. laying out the maps of the Patagonian desert. Together, they realized that the justice system hadn't just made a mistake, it had been used as a weapon. The Casus paradox was a deliberate smokescreen. By convicting two men, the state ensured that the public would be too busy arguing about which man was guilty to ever look at the company that stood to lose everything. Today, the wind still sweeps across the plains, but it no longer feels like a weight. The transformation of the oil rigs into a nature reserve is a victory that Johanna would have cherished. Every time a new lily is planted in the memorial garden, it represents a word of the truth that was once suppressed. Edith Casus has reclaimed her name. She no longer looks in a mirror and sees a shadow. She sees a survivor. The story of the twins is no longer a crime noir. It is a testament to the fact that no matter how deep you bury the truth, the earth will eventually spit it back out. The truth has no twin. It stands alone, in loving memory of Johanna Casus. Justice served, peace found.
And this year's recipient of the Johanna Casus Scholarship for Justice.
Forget what they told you about beauty. Your voice is your power, and it's time you started using it.